That was a recording of Victor Savant playing my piece for piano and pre-recorded sound, Yadim. And accordingly, I've come to the home of another pianist. This is the Liszt House. After Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Jena in 1806 and the eventual inclusion of Saxe-Weimar and Eisenach in the Confederation of the Rhine, the ecology of ideas that had generated the Weimar identity thesis was disturbed and degraded, and many of its component parts were scattered. Hegel eventually settled in Berlin after the Napoleonic Wars drew to an end and began to extrapolate his version of what had happened in those heady days of his youth. He concluded it was important to create a logical systemization of knowledge that would turn the Weimar identity thesis into something more akin to geometry. Meanwhile, Schelling settled in Munich, at least for a while, and focused on the unsystematic nature of freedom, and in particular the link between aesthetics and soteriology. In his The Philosophy of Revelation, he asked, nostalgically, how it might ever be possible to reconcile actual historical experience with the speculative syntheses of Hegel and others, given that political events of recent decades had not revealed the utopian outcomes aspired to by the idealistic spirit of their youth. Schelling, along with his old friend Friedrich Schlegel, countered Hegel's work by insisting reason must reconnect with the social and political. The two men argued for a convergence of art with the practical matters of ethical life. Indeed, Schelling spent his last few years at the same university in Berlin that had previously engaged Hegel and Fichte before, arguing for a more cryptic and ambiguous approach to dialectic thought, and influencing the young Soren Kierkegaard in the process. In some senses, the decades in the ducal state of Saxe-Weimar and Eisenach after 1806 were characterised by a degree of intellectual vacuity, at least in comparison to what had come before. Schiller and Herder had died, Wieland was by now in his 70s, and most of the Jena romantics had left the area, only Goethe remained. Yet the town fully appreciated the significance of what had occurred in those golden years and continued to attract many artists in particular. Weimar remained an influential cultural centre in the decades after Goethe's death, in particular as a centre of music, after Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, the daughter of the Russian Tsar, who became daughter-in-law to Duke Karl August in 1804, brought the piano virtuoso Franz Liszt to Weimar in 1842 to be the conductor of the court orchestra and the director of the music theatre. The famous musician lived for many years at the Altenburg, but after a scandal and a few years away, he moved into the apartment on the top floor of this house in 1869. The building's now a museum celebrating his achievement and containing his original piano. I'm going to go inside with my camera, courtesy of the Klassik Stiftung. That was a recording of Victor Savant playing my piece for piano and pre-recorded sound, Yadim. And accordingly, I've come to the home of another pianist. This is the Liszt wrote a lot of virtuosic piano music for this instrument, but I'd like to focus upon one of his pieces for orchestra, his Faust Symphony, which was inspired by Goethe's drama of the same name and premiered in Weimar in 1857 at the inauguration of the Goethe-Schiller monument in a Theaterplatz that I visited in my first episode. The music creates musical portraits of the three main protagonists in the drama, Faust, Gretchen and Mephistopheles. First, there's Faust. Faust's opening theme comprises a sequence of augmented triads encompassing all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. No other composer managed a theme like that for another 50 years. But Faust is a dreamer, and he's engaged in the interminable search for truth. their only aim some innovative finding. With gentle touch and spiritual power, they build transparent forms by the hour. Then, in eternal silence, in the crystal, they watch the destiny of all things mortal. And then there's the Gretchen of the flutes and clarinets, forever sweet and innocent. And then of the oboe, true to heart, loving and truly ascendant when accompanied later by the cello. She's obsessed by Faust, and he can be heard in the music in this movement too. She's a part of him, just as he's a part of her. O bow down, you peerless one, you radiant one, your face in mercy towards my bane. My true beloved, no longer clouded, returns to me again. And at the last there is Mephistopheles, spirit of the corrupt and diabolic, mocking Faust, courting Faust with anarchical chromaticism, despicable fugues and loathsome irony, terrible things. You clowns, you giant flying creatures, grasp at the air, grant yourselves no rest. Your strong arms and sharp-clawed features are sure to hold the fluttering fugitive fast. Mephistopheles taunts and ridicules Faust with the young fellow's own themes, twisting them and debasing them. But Faust loves it. He loves it all, and Liszt loves it all too. His compositional mastery is as redemptive as that of any god, or at least that's the illusion. I've noticed that conductors often beam with joy when they conduct this movement, and in the end, with the choir and words of heavenly ascension hanging in the air, then there is sublime rapture, just as in the Goethe. This is Liszt's study. Notice the portrait and the death mask of Beethoven, who Liszt had admired and emulated since he was young. Beethoven had used programmatic tools in his Sixth Symphony, but the question I want to ask here is, what does it mean to create a musical portrait? What is the allusion? How is it that mind can conceive the characteristic of a person, such as Faust, by way of musical expression? To answer this question, I need to look at the link between the musical and non-musical elements, in this case the characterizations. Perhaps I can begin by looking at how semantic links operate in other language domains. In linguistics, figurative language, and metaphor in particular, is used to make allusions from one context to another. For instance, choosing something at random, the term musical chairs refers to a children's party game, but it might also be possible to describe metaphorically the frequent movement of elected officials from one office to the next as an equivalent of musical chairs, characterizing the seemingly random and childishly futile element of this movement. The metaphor is used as a mechanism to add clarity and greater insight by using the stereotype of another semantic. Gary Hagberg said, "The reductive impulse in dealing with metaphor is provided fuel by a prior fundamental concern for descriptive truth." Indeed, metaphor is used when it offers a better means for describing a situation than literal language. If I refer to a community as a melting pot, my audience will probably know intuitively I don't mean that everybody in the community is melting as a result of the heat, or that members of the community are ensconced in any kind of a real pot at all. My metaphor, if it's even possible to paraphrase such a thing, alludes to a sharing of disparate ideas or cultural values that fuse together to create a new shared community. But it's far more meaningful to say a melting pot. Similarly, music can use various functions, such as rhythms or harmonies or other patterns, to allude to other stereotypical types of music. For instance, I could say that Shostakovich's 7th Symphony uses a snare drum to allude to military marches, and Strauss's Till Eugen Spiegel's Merry Pranks uses a combination of repeated motives, along with certain orchestrational devices, to allude to traditional folk music. These metaphors all have something in common. They all employ cliché. Given the differences between one medium and another, allusion needs to refer to objects that are easily recognisable. If I refer metaphorically to space travel by using the Star Trek theme, it's because I know my audience will almost certainly have heard the theme previously and be able to make the connection. I recognise that metaphors must begin somewhere and must go through some kind of an acculturalisation process whereby they become clichés in the first place. And no doubt linguistics can account for how this process occurs in language development. But my point is that the vast majority of allusion employs metaphors that are well established and easy to identify. It's the same with music. A militaristic snare drum or whimsical clarinet melodies are not terribly original ideas, but they're effective metaphorical tools because of their cross-medium lucidity. However, there's something else that gives them potency, the particular context of use. The allusion made by the Shostakovich snare drum actually reaches beyond that of a military band. Given the historical context he was writing in, the drum also alludes to the spirit of resistance to militarism and totalitarianism. The musical allusion becomes a powerful symbol of resistance itself. Similarly, the clichés played by Strauss's clarinet in Till Eulen Spiegel's Merry Pranks allude to the spirit of the trickster. These connections, these representations of trickery, are not derived by a consideration of musical matters alone. They depend upon the extension of metaphor into analogous content by way of the creative imagination of the listener. This is the Altenburg, not far from the park in Weimar, where Liszt lived when he wrote Faust and sought to employ the same extended devices. He makes allusion to characterizations in the music, which then refer to the context of the book, which in turn augment the allusion. The listener empathizes with Gretchen's characterization in the music because they know of her tragedy. However, Tom Service, writing in the Guardian newspaper, was not satisfied with the notion of metaphorical allusion. He said that actually there's a bigger issue at stake in Liszt's symphony. For Liszt, his orchestral music, including his tone poems as well as his symphonies on Faust and Dante, wasn't an attempt to do something extra musical, in the sense of relying on outside sources, stories or images or plays, for its expressive concentration. Instead, they're proof of what Liszt felt the true power of music could be, that it could do something much more elemental than simply represent or stand metaphorically for ideas or emotions. It could actually embody them as experiences. Service is introducing an idea that reaches beyond that of metaphor. He's saying Liszt's characterizations are not merely allusion, but that they exist in the music, that the nature of Liszt's music itself is able to embody expression. Or perhaps not. He was saying that the experience of music embodies the experience of the allusion, that by experiencing the intensity of music expression, it will be as if experiencing the ideas or emotions of the music. Perhaps this is not such a radical claim after all, but I'd like to consider things further. Embodiment is a difficult idea to disentangle because it's often used in a metaphorical sense itself, which obscures its meaning. But taken literally, I think it's reasonable to say it's an indication of one thing being contained intrinsically within another. A water molecule might be described as having oxygen and hydrogen atoms embodied within it. My brain is embodied in my body, and my mind is embodied in, well, who knows? But actually, it doesn't mean anything to say ideas and emotions are embodied in music by way of experience. The experience of music is a mental phenomenon, oriented on making meaning from cognitive experience, whether it's of ideas or emotions or even the music itself. And so, of course, its efficacy is a posteriori. It's based on experience. If I smell an odour that reminds me of something from my childhood, the experience of smell and the memory are both intentional processes interpreting experience. Modern cognitive science could describe this in more detail, But it wouldn't contradict the claim that the expression of trickery experienced in music and the recourse to trickery, as seen in the behaviour of another individual, are by necessity both perceived as experiences. The efficacy of the Weimar identity thesis lies not in equivalency of things in experience anyhow. As Service said, Liszt is not just metaphor. It's the equivalency of entities of experience and entities of nature. The Weimar identity thesis posits that the mental phenomena of trickery or militarism or experiences of aesthetic affections are all embodied in nature. As a part of the Weimar tradition and steeped in its history and values, Liszt would have been fully aware of the notion of the embodiment of natural phenomena in mental phenomena and the embodiment of the natural behaviour of humans in the expressive realm of music. As I've said, the Weimar identity thesis defines a relationship between representations in the mind and the actuality of existence as a kind of identity, whereby the functions of external reality, whatever that might mean, are analogous to the functions of the interiority of the mind, whatever that might mean. In considering Service's suggestions of embodiment, I'm asking then whether Faust's behaviour, which in turn embodies Gretchen's and Mephistopheles' behaviour, perceived as an external object by an audience as a result of music expressivity, reveals the inner life of mind. Let me simplify this so I can more easily explain the problem. If I say that a friend of mine embodies some emotion, such as sublimity or misery or happiness, if I use a metaphor such as my friend breathes happiness, then, to paraphrase, I mean that the behaviour of my friend frequently represents the way I might behave if I were feeling happy. I call upon my experience of emotion and deduce that because my friend is a human like me, they're able to experience the same emotions as me, and, in this case, they seem to be particularly well disposed to expressions of happiness. However, it's important to recognise that happiness or any other emotion is a function of the mind. It's not an attribute of entity of mind or of existence, and it's not an attribute of self-awareness. According to the Weimar identity thesis, consciousness can perceive happiness, but happiness is not embedded in consciousness. Here's a graphic to illustrate the point. The mental processes of level 3 are said to be identical to natural processes. For example, the sense of purposiveness perceived by the mind in harmonic progressions is equivalent to the purposiveness revealed in nature. However, levels 1 and 2, pertaining to the entity of mind and consciousness, are only identifiable with their respective levels and not level 3 processes. This is a matter concerning different levels of ontology, or what things are, the attributes of the respective existence of different levels of mind. Indeed, when romantic art claims representation of the inner life of the mind by way of aesthetics, whereby external manifestation reveals the internal, this is not a claim to some further ontological or metaphysical superstructure. So, let's consider Service again. He said, music for Liszt possessed a magical power that could transcend other art forms by becoming the sublime, otherworldly and transcendent encounters that painting or literature could only symbolise. Notice the use of the word becoming, which is very apt given it's often used by idealists in terms of the elevation of consciousness. But in this case, Service is identifying the aesthetic with the metaphysical. He's suggesting the entity of music is transforming into something new by way of his expression, or at least that this is Liszt's intention. Early Romantic art, inspired by the Weimar identity thesis, incorporating the subjective subject-object identity of Fichte and the principles of Faustian striving, and the objective subject-object identity of Schelling and the principles of intellectual intuition, and the dialectic subject-object identity of Hegel and the principles of absolute freedom, makes the claim that expression of function in nature, including the medium of art, can reveal functions of the mind. Happiness in the music is happiness experienced phenomenally by the mind. They're the same thing. In this sense, Mephistopheles' cunning expressed in the music is equivalent to the experience of cunning perceived by the mind when listening to the music. However, Romantic art doesn't make the claim that music embodies consciousness or the entity of mind. Indeed, this is Hegel's point. truth revealed by art is more significant than that observed in the social, economic or historical worlds, and music in particular can generate tendencies that elevate the individual towards the goal of absolute freedom. However, music is not mind or consciousness. It's limited because it cannot itself be lifted to freedom. It cannot in itself become sublime and otherworldly. Only mind can achieve such things. However great its expressive power, music is always just a vehicle. Actually, Liszt subtitled his work in Drei Charakterbildern, or Three Character Sketches, which doesn't suggest any reference to identity at all. It limits itself to metaphorical allusion. I concede this music has a magical power. I concede I can experience it as sublime and otherworldly. I can empathise with the mind beyond the behaviour when I hear this figure returning in Liszt's music. I concede that the music might metaphorically refer to the impenetrable mind of another. But I cannot conceive that these notes, played in this order, embody mind, that they contain mind within the very essence of their pitches. Actually, Faust might as well be without reflective self-consciousness in the way he follows his whims at every turn, always pursuing one experience or desire after another in the name of freedom, presumably freedom from following his whims at every turn. Mephistopheles and Gretchen are nobodies in the music too. They're merely a part of Faust, one tugging him along in one direction towards ever greater debauchery, and the other pulling him back in the other direction towards the straight and narrow, as convention would have it. Of course, Faust wants both. In the music cliché, he wants everything, which is why he's not a person. He's unable to reflect. He's a desire machine, which is great for Liszt. How can you compose a characterization of a real person anyway? It's far easier to show the exterior characterizations of a person, chasing one orchestral timbre after another with triumphant fanfares and sumptuous strings and clashing cymbals. I'll finish with another sample from my piece Yarim for piano and pre-recorded sounds. This is one of only a few pieces I've written that was intended as entirely abstract and not expressive of anything extra musical whatsoever. Thanks for listening.